ERI Safety Videos presents Expedition to Safety. This powerful program takes the safety lessons learned from climbing Mount Everest and applies them to you and your workplace. Jim Elzinga is an internationally recognized mountain climber who works with industrial organizations to improve their safety performance. His passion is helping everyone he works with achieve a zero-injury, zero-incident safety standard.
My name is Jim Elzinga, and I've been climbing and pursuing outdoor adventure for over 40 years. Along the way, I've learned many lessons about what it takes to stay alive in hazardous environments. And you may be surprised at how well my experience in the world of mountain climbing applies to staying healthy and alive in your world, here in the workplace and beyond.
In this one-of-a-kind presentation, Jim Elzinga explains how the end goal of summiting Mount Everest and the end goal of your organization's safety program are one in the same.
Reaching the top is not my definition of success on the mountain. For me, success also means getting everyone to the bottom again, safe and alive. This must also be the goal at your facility, to return everyone home safely at the end of each shift. This may seem simple, but when faced with everyday pressures and challenges, this commitment can fade and people die.
And whether that goal is reaching the summit or achieving zero injuries, Jim Elzinga explains the benefits of creating measurable milestones along the way.
Establish some milestones, some measurable steps that each worker and each department can focus on as steps towards the larger goal.
Jim explains that reaching a large goal requires the efforts and belief of all team members.
These team members believe 100% in the plan to reach the summit and embrace their individual roles in making it happen.
By sharing stories of remarkable individual efforts by climbers, Jim convinces workers that their individual efforts are critical for their organization to reach its safety goals.
All told, he did over 30 consecutive carries, climbing 400 miles up and back. At that altitude, with no supplemental oxygen, this was a tremendous feat of perseverance and endurance. Dan did this because he believed 100% that his individual effort would help us reach our goal. So now I'll ask you, what kind of individual effort are you giving for your organization to reach the pinnacle of safety and achieve at a culture where zero injuries are possible? Each one of you must believe 100% that your individual effort is helping to achieve the overall goal of keeping all workers safe and injury-free.
During his first expedition to Mount Everest, Jim witnessed firsthand the tragic results of poor leadership, poor communication, and an unsafe safety culture.
When it all settled, we realized that a massive avalanche had come down into the icefall and had rolled right over the climbers and the Sherpas. To this day, I still get angry about this because I know those climbers would not have been there but for the breakdown of our safety protocols and the culture of poor leadership that had taken hold in our expedition. Because of the hazardous, unpredictable, and uncontrollable conditions in icefall, it's not uncommon for people to be killed while climbing through it. So why go that way?
Jim explains the faulty logic that routed his team through the dangerous Khumbu icefall.
And the vast majority of climbers end up here because it's simply the way it's always been done. Does that sound familiar to any of you? Well, I can tell you in mountain climbing and here in your workplace, blindly following tradition and doing it the way that it's always been done is not necessarily the best way to deal with hazards or unsafe conditions. Many climbers die on Mount Everest when they become so fixated on reaching the summit that they lose all perspective of the dangers around them.
Jim takes an honest look at risk-taking and explains the dangerous temptation to press on in spite of unsafe conditions.
To understand and manage risk, you need to understand a little bit about human nature. People do not take risks unless there is something to be gained from it. I would not have been climbing all those mountains for the last 4 decades if I did not get something from it. The problem with this is that people can become so focused on the potential payoffs of the risk that they lose all perspective of the potential loss. As a climber who wants to stay alive, I'm passionate about understanding risk, and perhaps I study risk a little more than the average person.
During the program, Jim encourages workers to rethink the balance between risk and reward in order to overcome the temptation to commit an unsafe act.
If you're one of the ones taking risks like this, you really need to stop and rethink what you are doing, because you clearly have a very skewed perspective of risk and reward and the value of your own health and life.
Jim Elzinga tells why he returned to Mount Everest for a second attempt to reach the summit.
Standing here is really quite difficult for me to impress upon you the impact of the tragedies and the circumstances of the 1982 expedition. I was so affected that I felt compelled to return to the mountain and bring with me a new approach to climbing. I knew that a return expedition to Mount Everest must have a fundamental goal of bringing everyone back alive, and that to do this, safety would have to be held as the highest value by all team members and leaders.
Jim explains that his new expedition's commitment to safety required that a new route, bypassing the dangerous Khumbu icefall, would have to be created.
We would climb the mountain from the other side, from Tibet, bypassing the icefall altogether. And doing this would be attempting to ascend the mountain on a route that had never been climbed before. I encourage each of you and your management teams to also be willing to think in terms of alternatives to the way things have always been done, and seek out new ways of doing things that will reduce risk. This is a creative way of embracing your responsibility for your own safety and the safety of everyone you work with, that could take your facility's safety standard to a whole new level. Would not have enough fuel to melt snow for drinking water.
Jim explains that being committed to safety often means turning back or stopping work until conditions can be corrected and made safe.
Sharon immediately recognized the danger of the situation and radioed down that the summit bid should be called off. This was a huge decision for her, because she was posed to become the first woman from the Western Hemisphere to reach the summit of Mount Everest. Sharon was truly living it by making a decision that her and Dwayne's safety were more important than her personal ambitions. And I'm telling you again, this is not an easy choice to make. And it's also the type of choice each one of you must be willing to make in similar circumstances. When unsafe conditions develop while performing your job, you must be able to stop the work until the conditions are corrected. That's living it. While Sharon was on the radio calling off the summit bid, we were all frantically digging in the snow, looking for the lost fuel canisters. Surprisingly, we found one fuel canister buried in a place where it had no business being. This one canister was just enough, so Sharon and Dwayne were back on track. And eventually, at 9 p.m., 12 hours after they first set out, we get word by radio that they are now standing on the summit of Mount Everest. Down below, we all celebrated our success in getting them to the top, because we all had a part in achieving it. It took all our efforts, every one of us, to reach such a seemingly impossible goal. It's like that here at your organization also. Creating a safety culture where zero injuries are possible can be achieved when each person lives it, by putting safety into each choice and decision they make.
The team's commitment to safety was tested multiple times.
Now I had to make good on my promise to Barry and Albie, the other two climbers who had been candidates for the summit. I had told them that if we had the resources and if the weather was still holding, then we would support them on the second summit attempt. Barry and Albie began their ascent and made it up to Camp 4, while I attempted to organize the support climbers and the necessary supplies. But unfortunately, at this point in the expedition, we had spent 76 days on the mountain, many at extremely high altitudes. All the other climbers were mentally and physically exhausted. Nobody had anything left to give. Nobody could make it up to Camp 5 to support Barry and Albie's bid for the summit. That night, I had to make what was for me the most difficult decision of the whole 3 years I was leader of the expedition. I had to ask them to come back down. It did not go over well. Now, managers and supervisors, I'm talking to you. You also have to stick to your guns. You can't let workers talk you out of enforcing safety rules. You can't look the other way here and there to make friends or avoid confrontation. If you do that, you'll undermine the safety culture. Stick to your guns. Enforce the rules. That's living it.
After successfully reaching the summit of Mount Everest and returning all climbers safely home, Jim explains how a successful safety culture can be maintained and passed down.
And I was very proud of what we had done. We had successfully climbed a new route up Mount Everest. Sharon Wood became the first woman in the Western Hemisphere to reach the summit. And most importantly, we brought everyone back off the mountain safely. We had reached the pinnacle of Mount Everest. So what's next? Well, for me, I truly love climbing, and I continue to climb all over the world. And as I climb, you may be surprised to hear me say this, I'm not the youngest climber out there. In fact, I'm one of the oldest. And as an experienced climber, what I really enjoy is mentoring younger climbers. I teach them many of the same safety survival lessons I have shared with you today. You see, the safety culture we created on our Everest expedition didn't end with the final descent. It went home with all the climbers. And we have passed it down from older climbers to younger climbers, not only through words, but through our actions, by our example. The same can be true of your workplace or any workplace that has developed a successful safety culture. Once established, a safety culture can be passed down to the next generation by the words and deeds of experienced workers. And when that happens, when a zero-injury safety culture becomes self-sustaining because the workers value it enough to pass it down, that's when you know your organization has truly reached the pinnacle of safety.
Help your organization reach the pinnacle of safety by using the culture-building principles found in Jim Elzinga's Expedition to Safety. Get your copy today from ERI Safety Videos.